Continuation of what we were talking about on Monday. So this is what I was hoping to talk about today, Wednesday, October 11th. A continuation of our discussion on reconstructing ancient climate. All right, so far we've looked at using ocean cores to examine foraminifera, which are kind of like the fossilized remains of one-celled organisms, and they are very temperature specific. Right? So that way, by looking at the different species of foraminifera, you can tell the average ocean temperature. Obviously, if the ocean was warmer, there probably would have been more precipitation, more rainfall because of more evaporation. If the ocean was colder, it probably led to drier conditions in the surrounding area, right? So this is very helpful for archaeologists. You could also, as we said before, use isotopes. Oxygen isotopes are also temperature specific. So a certain oxygen isotope ratio will again allow you to tell the average temperature of the ocean at that time, and then you can extrapolate that to the global temperature at that time. As we said before, archaeologists who was looking at the collapse of one of the world's earliest empire thought that there was a link between a drought that he was able to document using ocean cores in the Mediterranean and looking at isotopes and the collapse of that empire. This very dry period corresponded to the exact time when that empire collapsed. You can also use ice cores for similar use, except it will give you more of a overall global conditions, right? But you can essentially use oxygen isotopes of the oxygen trapped in the ice, right? That has been created layer by layer in places like Greenland. You can dig down into the ice itself, extract a core, date each layer, and then look at the isotope ratios within the water there, the oxygen isotope ratios of the ice, and then be able to calculate the global temperature at that time. So again, very, very useful technique. Archaeologists use these kinds of things to document, let's say, when there were major changes in ancient societies, if they correspond also to environmental events, or learning about if the environment actually had an impact on ancient societies. So we're going to look at a couple of examples, but one example that I like is the expansion of people from Southeast Asia into the Pacific Islands. It occurred around 1200 AD, and when archaeologists and climatologists and geologists looked at the weather patterns from that time period, they saw that this was probably a period with less severe wind patterns. And so the opportunity to colonize the Pacific was more open at that time. And so it kind of gives us a perspective on maybe why the migration of people occurred specifically at that time, right? But it's pretty amazing because people use these double-hulled canoes, like you probably see in Moana, and were able to navigate their ways to different islands without compasses, right? Just using the stars and ocean currents. Okay, another important aspect of reconstructing ancient climate is looking at coastlines, right? So there's several ways to do this. Obviously, during the Ice Age, the ocean levels were lower, but archaeologists use sediment cores. They look at the actual sediment in the cores. What kind of sediment? Is it riverine sediment? And so, many people know about the fact that Siberia and North America were connected in some way, either with land covered in ice or land with an ice but with a strip where people could actually navigate through, or some people think that people hug the coastline to get from Siberia to North America. But we know that these two continents were connected. We also know that during the end of the Ice Age, the British Isles and the mainland were connected, right? So Britain was not really an island yet at that point. Another famous case that they used this work on was the Black Sea, right? So it turns out that the Black Sea was about this level before this area opened up and water from the Sea of Marmara and the Mediterranean flooded into the Black Sea. Right? And this actually, so this happened around 6000 BC. And prior to that time, you had people living along the coast. Right? So archaeologists were able to go to the Black Sea, and they could actually find the ancient coastline. They could find the mud brick houses and the villages of the people that are now underwater that used to be right on the coast. Now, this major flood event, some people have speculated, was this a major flood event that impacted people and gave rise to the story of Noah and the Great Flood? There's no way of knowing that, but what we do know is that this had an important impact on the environment, and that the Black Sea's levels that we see today were not what they were, let's say 6000 BC. And this is also true of rivers, right? So it's important to document, let's say, the courses of rivers in ancient times in order to determine why people placed their sites where they did. Because if you go to Mesopotamia today, if you go to southern Iraq, a lot of the ancient sites are now in the desert. And, of course, it doesn't make sense to put a major city there, but they used to be out in the Euphrates or canal of the Euphrates. But then the Euphrates shifted over time, and those cities were left kind of out to dry. Yeah, so you can see that sometimes we're using satellite photos and other techniques. You can document where ancient riverbeds and ancient canals were that may no longer exist, right? So you can see kind of the modern canal here. You can see a rook over here, and you could see some of these lines in the landscape that used to be canals and river systems. Okay, so that's another very important method. We also briefly mentioned tree rings, right? Tree rings, again, are great because if you have a sequence, you can date the tree to a specific year. So let's say, when that tree dates to, but then the rings themselves can tell you whether it was a wet or dry year. So to give you an example, looking at the early English settlements in North America, Roanoke, the Lost Colony, and also Jamestown, when they looked at tree rings, they saw that during the period right before this colony was abandoned, right, you can see that there was a series of dry years, and in Jamestown there was a series of very severe dry years, right? You can see how thin these are compared to here and here, and look, this was a very kind of wet period right there. But when Jamestown almost was abandoned, right, and people really suffered, was a period of major drought. Okay. You can get this kind of information without cutting down the tree. You can actually core into the tree and extract a core to look at the rings without actually having to cut down the tree. So they've used this in many, many cases, right, to look at many different archaeological sites. Okay, there are other methods as well. We're going to look at a couple of them. Figuring out what kinds of plants existed there. Looking at the pollen, right? That is also very important, right? So you guys right now, or you did today, a project on seasonality, where you look at the kinds of plants that were found in the archaeological site and the kinds of things that were eaten, and you can document when people were living at those archaeological sites, right? Well, if you use things like seeds, right, and also wood, right, some of the seeds are very specific to species, so you can tell, let's say, a millet seed from a sorghum seed, from a barley seed, right, and you can tell when or what the environment was like. Let me give you an example. Right? Wheat grows well in the Middle East, so does barley. Barley, though, is a more hardier crop. It grows better in drier conditions and hotter conditions, and it's also more resistant to salts in the soil. So there have been times where they've seen at archaeological sites people growing wheat and barley at a certain period, and then later on they're only growing barley. And that probably indicates that either they're overusing the land and the soil's getting enriched in salts, or that the weather is changing and it's becoming drier or hotter. All right, so different proportions of plants can tell you a lot about if there was change over time. And that also goes for pollen, right? What kind of plants existed outside of the site and the pollen blew into the site, right? So for example, if you've got tree pollen in the area, that's going to tell you one thing. If you have very little tree pollen but lots of grass pollen, maybe you're looking at deforestation, maybe caused by humans. Certain plants will do better in drier conditions. Other plants will do better in wetter conditions. So you can use the pollen of these plants to figure out, okay, was it wet, was it dry, was there forest, what did the people deforest the area, right? And deforestation especially is one thing that people have looked at with ancient civilizations like the Maya to try to understand maybe why they collapsed. But in the Old Kingdom in Egypt, right, they've used ancient pollen in archaeological sites to demonstrate that there was drought, there was also fire, right, and that this drought changed the plants in the surrounding area, which was indicated by the pollen, and this might have led to a real downturn and sharp decline in Egyptian culture at the end of the Old Kingdom. Another piece of plants that you could use besides pollen are things called phytoliths, right? Phytoliths are the silica shell casings, basically, of the cell walls in parts of the plant, like the stalks, right? So parts of the cells actually have kind of a silica wall almost. These things will preserve because they're not organic, right? So you'll have these small pieces of silica that you can look at under the microscope and that are specific to species. So again, if you can recover phytoliths, you can say, oh, there was a high amount of certain type of grass that indicates that it was a very dry and hot conditions during this time, right? Or we see phytoliths of plants that did well under weather conditions. And so here you can see different phytoliths, and different phytoliths are specific to species, so you can tell species apart, right? This is a very important plant, the agave plant, right? Because tequila comes from it. Okay, now a lot of these paleo ethno-archaeologists, you could call them, or paleobotanists, right, who study ancient plants and study humans' use of ancient plants and using plants to reconstruct the environment, right? You can see one famous paleobotanist, and I've worked with her. Her name's Naomi Miller, right? She's published a lot on ethnobotany and paleobotany, and basically she's sifting through the sediments that were collected from the site, and she's separating out seeds and pollen so that she could study them later and figure out what kinds of food people were eating, but also what the environment was like, right? So again, this is wheat and this is barley, and like I said before, the proportions of wheat versus barley can tell you if the conditions were hot and dry or if they were pretty mild. Okay, similar to foraminifera, there are these things called diatoms. Right? These are unicellular algae found in lakes, found in oceans, right? Usually found in fresh water. You can see they're very, very distinct depending on the species. And the species is specific to the kinds of conditions in that environment. So temperature and also salt water versus fresh water. Right? So by reconstructing what species of diatoms you have in the bottom of the lake, in your, let's say, lake core of sediment, you can figure out what the conditions were like in that area. The diatoms, like the phytoliths, are made from silica, right? So you can see they're basically little glass casings where these organisms existed inside of. And one of the interesting things is that back in the day, the 19th century, from what I've read, they used diatoms. The silica in the diatoms, they used it as toothpaste powder or in toothpaste powder as a mild abrasive, right? We don't do that anymore. We use substitutes for that, but the tiny pieces of silica were perfect for that kind of use. Right? Okay, here you can see another diatom. Okay, animals, as we'll see when we look at zooarchaeology, are very important for reconstructing the environment as well, because animals are specific to conditions like temperature. Right? So one case we'll look at is archaeological sites in North America. If you see a shift from caribou to red deer, you can estimate that the climate got warmer through time, because caribou tend to do better in colder environments and deer tend to do better in warmer environments. And so if you see a shift in species, it might also indicate a shift in the environment as well. Right? So these kind of conditions, understanding these conditions, are important to understand change in ancient human societies. Right? That is, what was going on when they developed agriculture? What were the conditions like when people were starting to domesticate plants and animals? What were the conditions like when this civilization collapsed? Can the environment explain why a civilization collapsed or why something happened? Right? So I'll give you a couple of good examples. The Maya, right? Drought and the reconstruction of drought in the Maya area is one avenue that archaeologists have taken to try and explain why the Maya collapsed around 900 AD. Why were all these cities abandoned here in the lowlands of the Yucatan? And they think that drought did have a role to play in it. Okay, what about Easter Island? Easter Island is, kind of a very popular archaeological site. It's kind of a mysterious place, right? We talked about Eric von Däniken said, well, how could they have made these statues without any trees? You could see it's pretty barren of trees, right? What archaeologists have done is they've actually excavated material, and what they have found is when these statues, Maoi, were being built, there was actually a lot of forests on the island. They found this with pollen, and they found it with tree seeds. That's told them that there was an abundance of trees in that area. Over time, they see this pollen disappearing, right? And what that indicates is that they were cutting down the trees. And the cutting down of the trees really negatively impacted the people, because it led to soil erosion, and it also led to the disappearance of, I don't have the picture here, but you can see the little bird over here, bird species that live specifically in that tree that they used to eat were gone as well, right? So this marked a real period of dramatic decline for the people of Easter Island. And of course, there's climate change today, and this, it seems almost a little crazy at this point to even argue whether the data shows there's climate change or not. Places like, you can see NASA. The funny thing is you can get a lot of climate data and also discussions of climate change if you go to websites associated with the Navy. Obviously, the climate change is going to impact the U.S. Navy, and they're following this very closely. Right? So, unfortunately, sometimes the way it's presented is that that climate change and whether it's happening or not is debatable. That there's an equal number of scientists on both sides. It's not true at all. Over 90%, 99% of scientists say that the data consistently shows that there is climate change and that humans have a big part in the cause of this climate change. Right? And what we see is that temperatures are increasing at a dramatic rate. Right? We know that I think it was records for hot summers. I think the top 3 hottest summers on record were just in the past 10 years, something like that. That's dramatic, right? That's not just normal fluctuation. right? And it has a lot to do, obviously, with greenhouse gases and other things. But because they've been able to document temperature over long periods of time, we can see, okay, our temperature compared to the temperature of the past. We see this, there are fluctuations, but then there's also overall trends, right? And so we see fluctuations, but we can see that overall trends towards warming, towards cooling, and then back towards overly dramatic warming. And you see that with the ice caps in Greenland, right, which are rapidly melting. You see that in glaciers in the Alps, glaciers elsewhere, right? And this is leading to, or probably contributing to, more severe storms, droughts, flooding events, right, etc., etc. Okay, so there's a lot that you can learn from reconstructing the environment, and this sort of field of geology and environmental science goes hand in hand with archaeology, and plays an important role in a lot of the research going into looking at why civilizations collapsed and how agriculture occurred, as well as other important dramatic events. Okay, so that's what I have for today. I'd like you guys to watch this before Monday, and on Monday we're going to start working on ceramics and lithics and other materials. So please email me if you have any questions, and have a good rest of your week.